Hi, everybody. It's Megan Malden, and I'm here with Dr. Heidi Ward, our Extension Veterinarian at the University of Arkansas, and we're bringing to you our fifth and final episode of our Vet Science Fridays at 4 for the Animal Senses series. And the final video that we're going to be doing today, Dr. Heidi Ward is going to talk to us about the animal sense of touch, and she has promised me that she's going to describe why it is that my cat is such a stinker and will not let me touch him. So I'm gonna pass the floor over here to Dr. Heidi Ward and let her talk to you about animals and their senses of touch.
Well, hello, everybody. It's a bittersweet day because we are ending this series, but we will end on a good note. And the sense of touch is probably the most complicated sense, and you're going to find that out. And it's because it's the largest organ, and also a lot of different pathways that the information can be sent to our brain. And I'm trying to not say the word so much. We'll see if I can manage to do that for this last presentation. Our first picture, you can see the cat. Animals can feel just like we can, and it can either be a good touch or a bad touch. And here you have the cat that is enjoying getting a little pet around the chest and the neck, but we also have to deal a lot with the bad touch as well. And this is a guy named Ruckus that managed to have an encounter with a porcupine. And luckily we don't have to deal with that as much here in Arkansas, but where I used to practice in Montana, probably every other week there was a dog in our practice that we had to sedate and pluck porcupine quills out of his face. And you would think they would learn, and they don't learn. So much for pain receptors teaching you something. But the sense of touch isn't just pain. There's actually lots of different things that we can sense, and we call that sensation. But the skin is the organ for the sense of touch. And the skin is the largest organ of the body. You may not think of it as an organ, but it is. It is packed with millions of touch receptors. And each receptor responds to different sensations. And all those nerves carry thousands of touch signals every single second to our brain. And a lot of that is information about temperature, humidity, other things that we can sense through our skin. And the skin covers the whole body. Because it covers the whole body, it's unlike the other senses that we've talked about, because eyes, nose, ears, mouth are all in our face right next to our brain. So they have basically a direct connection through those cranial nerves to the brain, but skin does not. Skin is all over the place. So they have lots of very fancy connections of nerves that finally converge onto the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is always involved, and then the spinal cord takes the information up to the brain. And sometimes it just gets a really quick reflex through the spinal cord, and we're going to show you that pathway too. The brain can filter out some of that information through touch, and that's what we call desensitization. We love desensitization. So, I'm wearing a shirt right now. Hopefully, most of you are wearing a shirt right now, but we don't really feel the shirt, and that's because our brain has turned it off. And there's actually an instance in veterinary medicine that we actually enjoy that as well, and that is with the animals and harnesses. When dogs come in with a harness, or cats wear harnesses too, that's been on them for a while, and their skin has desensitized because it's had that constant touch and somewhat pressure too from that harness. And guess what? We give injections right in that area on the shoulder where the front part of the harness and the side part of the harness meet. So they don't even feel those injections if they have a harness on. So that is one way that we really like desensitization in veterinary medicine. Let's take a close-up of the skin, since it is the organ for the sense of touch. This is a section of dog skin. And I'd like to mention first that there are three parts to skin. There's the epidermis, which is the very top part, which is what we really think of skin. Then underneath is the dermis. It's the thickest part because that's where all the stuff lives. The hair follicles live there. Oil glands, which are also called sebaceous glands, they live there. That's also where a lot of our touch receptors live. And then there's the hypodermis. We call that the subcutaneous layer in veterinary medicine, or in medicine in general, and that is because we relate that to injections, subcutaneous injections. And as you can imagine, since that dermis is the area where most of the pain receptors are, between the dermis and the epidermis, it'd be a good idea that we have injections where we're putting in liquid and stuff into the subcutaneous layer because there aren't as many pain receptors there. And another fun fact about that subcutaneous area, why we give injections there, especially for vaccines, is that there are a lot of immune cells that live in that tissue area that can process the vaccine and help to make antibodies. So lots of reasons that we like the subcutaneous tissue. But there's something you may notice that is missing in a section of dog skin, and I could give you a hint. It has to do with heat, and that is sweat glands. Dogs do not have sweat glands in the skin that covers their body. Dogs and cats do not have sweat glands. Horses do. And if any of you have been riding a horse and you take off the saddle, you'll see that they are wet. They are super sweaty underneath that saddle. But cats and dogs do not. Instead, they do have some sweat glands on the very bottom of their feet, on their paw pads. So they could get sweaty paws, but they do other things to help them control heat and to regulate their body temperature. And of course, we know panting, they'll stick out their wet tongue and they'll let the air cool the wet tongue, and then that's one way to cool down. Cats take it an extra step. They'll use the saliva from their tongue and lick themselves and coat themselves with wet saliva, and then that interacts with the air and can cool down their skin. So that's pretty neat way that they can deal with heat. We just sweat, and all the time, especially today. Oh my gosh, it's hot out there. Let's talk about the basic sensations, because we've already been talking about heat. So there's also cold. We all know pain, but there are also other different sensations that our skin can detect, and all animal skin can detect. Now, I can't tell you why this little boy is wanting to touch this tarantula. I'm assuming it is his pet and not some rando tarantula he's going up to poke, because that could be bad. But you'll notice that the tarantula is touching him with one of his little spider legs. And I like spiders, so I won't call it a creepy spider leg. It's just one of his little spider legs. What do you think he's feeling? What do you think his skin is detecting when he's feeling that little spider leg? It's not going to be really heavy. It isn't going to be scratchy or hurt. It's going to be really, really soft touch. So that's a faint touch. That's one sensation that you could get, is faint touch. Then there is just hot, cold, and pain, which is what we normally think of. And those two are up in the epidermis, the very top layer of our skin. There's also light pressure. So the picture has the girl touching her lips. If you just very lightly touch your lips, that's light pressure, not an unpleasant pressure. There's stretch. So if you pinch your skin, not really hard, not to enough where it gets those pain receptors, but enough that you can feel the stretch. And then there's also deep pressure. So if you really squeeze and then you're hitting those receptors that's down deep in that hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer. Let's take a closer look at these different receptors. Those touch that do the hot, cold, and pain are right up at the top, and they are raw nerve endings, and you can see it. It looks like just little branches of a tree that are crawling up. Raw nerve endings, you will sense, that's the first thing you will sense. And because of that, this is going to be the pathway that has a super fast reflex through the spinal cord. Remember that. The one that's next one down, that's kind of on the border of the epidermis and the dermis, is the light pressure receptors. And then we have faint touch. Faint touch is actually in the dermis, but they're right underneath the epidermis. We do have receptors that surround our hair follicles. So if you pull out a hair, it hurts. That's from those hair follicle receptors, and it's pain always. And then in the subcutaneous layer, we have our deep pressure and our stretch receptors. And they all look different. They're different receptors, not only on what they can detect, but also how they look. That's why we classify them differently. They also take some different pathways up to the brain through the spinal cord. I can't forget to talk about vibrisal hairs. Another word are vibrissae. They're whiskers. So here's our cat with the long whiskers. We think about cats and whiskers go together like peanut butter and jelly, right? But whiskers are different. We do not have them as humans. A lot of other animals do. In fact, most of the mammals do. There's a few that don't. They do have several receptors for touch. And I mean, they are chock full of them. Also, animals that have whiskers have special parts of their brain that are bigger to process all the information from these whiskers. And here's a close-up of what one of those whisker follicles would look like. So the yellow on the outside is actually the epidermis. That little inside is the actual hair follicle. And you'll see down at the bottom, the black lines that go to the very bottom are all nerve endings. And you'll notice that they creep up and kind of actually surround that entire follicle. And all of those have different information, and we really do not completely understand all the different pathways that where these nerves go to in the brain. And also what they're finding out from that information. Let's talk about the spinal column for a second. So as I mentioned, the skin is the largest organ. And because of that, it has lots of nerve endings and lots of nerves that have to come together to go to the spinal column to go up to the brain. If you look at the figure, this is just a girl, and this is all the different peripheral nerves, that's what we call them, that come off the spinal cord. And they branch off all the way from your neck through your chest to the end of your fingertips all the way down to your toes. And all of those have little endings that was what you see on the skin section, all those different tiny receptors. Okay, and the spinal cord meets up, and this is what it looks like in a dog as well, and the spinal cord travels up to the brain. There's different sections of spinal cord. When all the little peripheral nerves meet up and converge onto one single nerve that goes into the spinal cord, that's called a spinal nerve root. And then the spinal nerve root has a ganglion. There's a dorsal ganglion, which we'll talk about, that does a lot of extra things. It's where it crosstalks with cells. Then there's the spinal nerve rootlets. So that's just rootlets that go into the actual spinal cord. There's a central canal in the middle of the spinal cord that has cerebral spinal fluid. There's a dorsal horn in the gray matter. The gray matter is called gray matter because it looks gray, and then it's surrounded by white matter. All the action takes place in the gray matter. The white matter is mainly supporting cells. The ventral horn, which is in the gray matter. And when you process, remember that touch that had the hot, cold, and the pain? We do have a reflex to that will automatically go through the spinal cord and send information to the muscles to get the animal to do something in response to that heat, that cold, or that pain, okay? And the way that works is you have those receptors, those touch receptors. Its cell body is actually in the dorsal root ganglion. And when it gets that information, that cell body will send a signal in the form of electricity, remember, through its axon. We talked about electrochemical. It turns electrical and sends the information to the actual spinal cord through the dorsal horn. and it interacts with a quick little intermediate cell that sends it directly to a cell that sends information back to the muscle. So the blue pathway is the afferent pathway that goes to the spinal column. That's the sensory part. And then the red part that you see is the efferent. And the way I always remember that for efferent is it causes an effect. And the effect is that you're either going to pull back your paw, or we know if an animal feels something painful really fast, a lot of animals' first response is to bite at it. So that's how we get bitten a lot of times with animals. And that also, by the way, you know, Megan, unfortunately with your cat, if you're hitting something that could be a little painful, their automatic reaction, they're not even thinking about it because it's a reflex, is to swat or to bite at you. And a lot of that is cats do have some ouchy lower backs. And if you pet on their lower back, that can make them automatically want to smack you. But we do know that they aren't as ouchy or painful around their neck, behind their ears. They do like to be pet behind their neck. And the good thing is that they can't swat you if you're petting them behind their neck. And really, if you do it right and you're right behind them, they can't even turn around to bite you. So the moral of that story is, if you want to pet an ouchy cat, do it on the back of the neck. Do not pet their back. They're going to get mad at you. Let's talk about another pathway. So the other touch pathways, where you're feeling the light touch, the stretch, all that other stuff, this is how it gets to the brain. And it's different. The touch pathway, so the square in the middle is just a representation of the skin. So that's where it starts. That's where you sense it in those receptors. It goes again through the afferent pathway to the spinal cord, but instead of whipping right through and coming back through efferent nerves, now it sends it up to first the brain stem, which is that little section in the middle, in between, and then it goes up to the thalamus, makes a little stop there, and then goes to its final destination, which is the sensory cortex of the brain. And then that is where the information is actually processed, is the sensory cortex. We have more branches in the thalamus, and that's because that has to do a lot with some of the other responses, like fear and things like that, to get a reaction from that sensory pathway. Okay, so that is just regular touch. But when we go to pain touch, it's just a skosh different. Now remember that pain touch is those touch receptors that have those raw nerve endings, and you can see in that little square section, it's showing those little finger-like raw endings. That one does a different pathway. So it could do the reflex, but it could do some other things too. It can also go in, and it could do both at the same time, by the way, but it'll still go through the dorsal horn, but this time it crosses over to the ventral horn of the other side and goes back up to the brain. And still goes to the brain stem, still it goes to the thalamus, still it goes to the sensory pathway. But it's just a different way that the pain pathway goes, because it has to go through the ventral horn. And again, you can have both the reflex and the pain pathway associated with those touch receptors. So very complicated. And you may think, why does there have to be different pathways when they're basically all going to the sensory cortex? And think of it just like traffic. You know, it's traffic. You need to you need to be able to figure out where it goes. But either case, when it's going to the brain, it crosses over. So whatever side of the body it is. So if I get a feather and tickle the left side of my hand, it's actually the right side of my brain that is processing that information. That's pretty cool. So a lot of crossover in all of the senses. So that is the scientific information behind the sense of touch. Now let's talk about some of the animals that have the best sense of touch. And I'm really only talking about two. And one's kind of really? Seriously? That animal? And it's the catfish again. We learned last week that the catfish have They do not have scales. They're one of the fish that do not have scales. They have smooth skin. And we learned last week that their skin is full of taste receptors, and their whiskers are full of taste receptors too. But their whiskers aren't vibrissae. They aren't hairs. They're actually projections of skin that are just full of taste receptors. They're also full of touch receptors, because remember I said they float around and they can detect stuff through motion too, and that's going to be touch receptors. But their whole skin is covered in these touch receptors, so they are pretty high up there on the sense of touch. But the animal that gets the award for the best sense of touch, again, I never would have guessed this in a million years. You may not even know what this animal is, but it's a manatee. A manatee has a very special ability to sense, and that's because they are covered in whiskers, not just hair. They are covered in whiskers. And this is a video from the Columbus Zoo. This is a manatee, and just watch him. When he comes up, him or her, you see all those little whiskers right there all over the face, just all over the face. But when he turns around and you see those long things that look like hairs, those aren't hairs. Those are whiskers covering the entire body. The manatee is covered in vibrissae, which is awesome. I think that is cool. So I learned something new too. I had no idea that manatees would have the best sense of touch. We do know that there are other insects that are the masters of touch too, with touch receptors. Think of them that know that you're coming, that can sense pressure before you even get to them. Flies. So flies know when you're about to hit pressure, they can fly away. Spiders are also extremely good with their sense of touch. But as far as animals go, it's the manatee. So this is the last one. I wanted to review all of the sensory winners in the animal kingdom. The first one was the sense of smell, and we found out that the bear has the best sense of smell. I don't think I mentioned that a bear can smell 20 miles away. If they're downwind and there is a carcass that they want to eat or food they want to eat, they could smell up to 20 miles away. That's crazy. Sight, the eagle is the winner because the eagle has special vision that they can see not only different colors that we can't see, but it can see really far down. And they also have oil droplets that they can see some of the things that are under the water, which was the fish, which was pretty cool. Hearing is the bat, and that's because the bat can use echolocation, and the bats can actually see by hearing, which is a really weird way to think of it, but that's what they do. With taste, we just talked about that. That's the catfish. And then our latest winner is the manatee. I think that is so cool. I learned a lot. I had so much fun doing this series with you guys. And as always, if you have questions, you can visit our Arkansas 4-H Vet Science page. It has all of my contact information. But I had a blast. And if anyone has any questions, Megan, I am more than happy to answer them.
Hey, Heidi. Well, once again, it looks like you were just incredibly thorough because we had a lot of people saying hi in the chat, but nobody who had any questions. So thank you again for this video and for the whole series. It's been really fun. I'm sad that it's coming to an end, but maybe we can do another series sometime in the future. So
I would love to. It's been so much fun.
Well, great. All right. Thank you again, Heidi, and hope everybody has a great weekend.
Bye, guys.